What is the barrier? What's the barrier? This is something I've puzzled over. And it isn't only about why does the trade world not speak to the climate world and vice versa. It's also, you know, Tagio and I, the last time I saw Tagio, we were in Frankfurt about 8 months ago, and we were at an amazing Blockupy demonstration outside the European Central Bank. And there were 40,000 people in the streets. And they had been giving fantastic speeches all day about the brutal impacts of German prescribed austerity on the rest of Europe and all of the social implications. But nobody had mentioned the word climate all day. And when I spoke, I did talk about the connections, because the connections are obvious, right? When we exist under austerity, under the logic of austerity, there is no possibility for the kinds of actions that we need in the face of climate change. All over Southern Europe, in Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, supports for renewables have been slashed. Public transit fees have gone up when they should be going down to encourage use. Italy is planning to double its offshore oil drilling. Greece is being pushed to get out of debt by drilling for oil and gas in the Ionian and Aegean. There are pushes for fracking in Spain. I could go on and on. The connections are obvious, you know, and yet the connections don't get made. And we can even point to the leaders of the biggest anti-austerity parties in Europe and the fact that they never mentioned climate change. I mean, some of them mentioned climate change for the first time last week. Why is it? Why is it that we stay in these silos? And I think some of it is habit. You know, I think, and I think that traditionally on the left, there is a feeling that almost like climate is the one issue you don't have to care about. You know, there's so many other issues so urgent, and I think climate change sort of had this reputation of being almost like this sort of bourgeois issue for people who don't have real issues to care about. Like, you know, Pablo Iglesias said people can't care about climate when they have to put food on the table. You know, I think you'd probably disagree. That this is not some luxury issue. This is about survival. And more than that, as a climate justice movement, we can chart the most credible path for how people can put food on the table, create millions of well-paying jobs, and bring down emissions at the same time. So, I think on the left, some of it is this habit. Some of it is, I think, exactly as you said, that it does challenge the growth imperative. And this must be said, that this, you know, it's easy to understand how climate change threatens an extreme right-wing worldview, right? If you don't believe in government, if you don't believe in collective action, if you don't believe in regulation, if you don't believe in taxation, climate change is going to make your hair catch on fire, right? If you must regulate, you must tax polluters to pay for it, you have to manage this somehow. But the truth is that there are large parts of the left that have really treated our economic system as purely a problem of distribution, and have not looked at this core problem of pursuing infinite growth on a finite planet. And so this is a challenge for all of us. It's really a challenge of worldview, of the worldview that we can take and take without limit. So I think that's the critique of the left. That's the mea culpa left critique. And I include myself in this. I came to climate late. You know, my wake-up call wasn't until 10 years ago when I was in New Orleans, when it was underwater, and it was so obvious what a neoliberal ideology and a racist society looked like with climate change. And it was impossible not to understand those connections. But it took me a long time, because I was one of those people who was just saying, oh, let the environmentalists deal with this one, we're busy, right? more troubling answer to the question. And, you know, I say this with some trepidation because I think unity is important in the movement. I think there are many forces trying to divide us. But the fact is that there are also parts of the climate movement that are more aligned with corporations than they are with working workers, that are more comfortable in rooms of elites than they are in rooms like this. And traditionally, there have been problems. You know, in the United States, there's some very, and Elena knows this history. There's some really painful history where, when we were in this huge fight against NAFTA, a really fateful struggle against the North American Free Trade Agreement, and our social movements were so strong against NAFTA that when Bill Clinton ran for president, he had to promise that he would reverse it, right? That he would not put it into practice, that he would renegotiate it. But then what happened is that he was able to divide the left with the help of Al Gore. Labor continued to oppose NAFTA after the Clinton administration took power, but they were able to peel off 10 big green groups and get them to support NAFTA because they added a clause saying it wouldn't hurt the environment in the preamble, right? Never trust a preamble, everybody. Never trust a preamble. So there is this history, and I would, you know, I think that I would love to hear Elena's perspective on this because, you know, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's a real history that we're still living out in the United States today, and there are still divides in the environmental community, but more and more I really do believe that we're seeing bigger, you know, consensus and unanimity in the climate movement on this issue. In the United States, the recent trade fight that we just fought was around a piece of legislation that would expedite the passage of trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you have organizations like 350.org that you know, weren't around in the NAFTA fight that came out in a big way. Other organizations, the Natural Resources Defense Council that might have previously supported NAFTA that came out against Fast Track and now the TPP in a major way. So the culture is shifting. And another thing I would just add is that while certainly at the government level the connection is not being made between trade and climate change, as Sierra Club, when we talk to our grassroots, when we talk to our chapter in New York that's been fighting against fracking, or in Colorado, or in California, there the communities and the activists really get it. They understand that the expansion of our current model of trade threatens the very causes that they've been fighting for, you know, for decades. So I think rooting these struggles with the communities that will be most impacted, and hopefully bringing along the bigger Greens as we go along.
Yes, if I may just add on this aspect of intellectual property rights, I think it's really a clear case, as you said, of how the corporate agenda trumps public policy, or how public policy is subordinated really to the corporate agenda. In the Philippines, we're not yet part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but the government is dying to be part of it. And part of the concessions, we got a leaked document. We have a law in the Philippines called the Cheaper Medicines Law that is supposed to guarantee people's access to affordable medicine. But because we want to join the TPP, the government is toying with the idea of amending the Cheaper Medicines Law to insert a provision on data protection, an agenda that is really being pushed by big pharmaceutical companies. Now on this issue of technology,